Good morning. The budget that I'm presenting today is carefully balanced. It builds for the future by saving money, paying down debt, and investing in the core needs of our state. Our long-term fiscal health depends on wise and prudent actions that we take. Now, over the last several years, we've made some tough decisions, tough budget cuts. We asked the people for temporary taxes, and the economy's recovered. All of that has put California in a very solid position. In contrast to just a few years ago, when there was a structural deficit of $20 billion looking long into the future. Now, we have a carefully balanced budget, more precarious than I'd like, but it is balanced, and we can keep it that way, but it will require self-discipline and real prudence. So to sketch this in greater detail, I want to just lay out some of the basic ingredients that you ought to keep in mind if you're going to understand the budget. As you see here, mostly red. Now we got a little balance, we got a little surplus, and now we got a little balance, and if you put a couple more years, they would be very much like that, basically flat. So it's not a time for exuberant overkill on our budget spending. This just takes one of the items, and there are more than one of these, that have long-term liabilities built in to current law that is very difficult to change. So these are our promises, and if we don't take any action, you're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars that we owe. And that's why I'm going to negotiate during our upcoming collective bargaining talks for the best deal I can get for the workers and the taxpayers. Because if we don't rein things in, then down the road there will be drastic cuts, just like there were over the last 10 years. It's either stop and start or a more steady as you go. And that's what I'm aiming for. Put that over there. So I think the first thing I'd like to say is education. This is what Proposition 30 was all about. This is the greatest consensus for spending that we have in California. It's for education. And you see the tremendous increase. It's about, it's over $2,000 per student. It's about $8 billion more. And that affects kids. And it also affects kids, particularly those who face the biggest challenges, the biggest barriers to success. And that's why we're spending a significant amount of money on programs that will benefit low-income children in the state. Just to summarize the program that we're laying out in the budget, we're spending money on water, flood protection, and combating climate change. This is about $500 million from the water bond. Then we have about $1 billion from the previous bond on flood protection. Second, we are putting money into the rainy day fund, and we're paying off some debt. I just mentioned the increase of $2,600 per student. That is the increase over the last 4 years. And remember, education took the biggest cuts, and that's why and because of Prop 98, they're getting restored. We're holding tuition flat for college students. We're expanding workforce training over $1 billion. We're providing medical health coverage to now 12.2 million people. That's a 50% increase. That's 4 million people. That's real money going to real people. And these are people who are not rich. They're not middle class. They're low-income people. And having this health security is a comfort, is decent, and it's going to improve the quality of their lives. One of the biggest causes of bankruptcy are medical bills. So when we spend all this money, and it's billions, when you add up with the federal government and the state and local, we're talking over $90 billion. But we're doing that, and it will keep growing. And by the way, in 4 years, we're going to have to spend, we're not going to get our 100% payment by the federal government, we're going to have to pay 10%, and that could be in the neighborhood of $1 billion. And that'll hit in about 4 years. So we got to get ready for that as well. And then we're going to pre-fund retiree health care, but it's part of a collective bargaining agreement, which will be part of the salary discussions, and that will be something we'll have to talk about. So with that, I'll open it to questions.
Governor, on the pre-funding, are you planning to open existing collective bargaining agreements and change them, or are you going to be negotiating that when the contracts expire?
As they come up, we have several of the employee groups are coming up for negotiation. That'll be our first point that we raise.
Governor, does the University of California need more money to avoid tuition increase, and how do you plan to avoid that?
I tend to avoid it by a very unique select advisory committee that I'm proposing. I mentioned in November. It'll come before the regents at the January meeting. It's an advisory committee composed of the president of the university and the president of the Board of Regents, which is me. And our two offices will work together with a team to look at all the ways we can reduce the cost structure. People need money, and how much money they need is always a matter of dispute. And we can always agree that for most people, more money is better than less money. That's kind of the operating principle in the modern world. Although if anyone listened to my wife's reading of her grandfather's inscription on the family Bible, you will know that money and property is not really the main goal in life. But I will not inflict that on the University of California as my guiding principle. However, we're going to look at the way the disciplinary structure of disciplines in higher education. We're going to look at the whole gamut of how to collaborate, how to get through students, get through quicker, have collaborations across the three segments using technology. They too can negotiate some pension and health care reforms and restrictions. So there's a lot of things we can look at. And I do think most people around the country who have looked at the cost structure of colleges say that there's savings that can be had, and that would be my goal because we do have a substantial amount of money. And we have been increasing it, by the way. The $120 million is not chump change. It's real money, and some parts of the budget didn't get any increase. So
the Assembly and the Senate have proposals to give more money to UC. Do you think that they don't really need that money? That's to say, more money is generally believed to be better than less money. But you see what we're faced up here with the budget. It's precariously balanced. It's going to get even more challenging as we get down the road. And there's a habit and a belief that the government is the engine of allocating the wealth increasingly and redistributing it. Well, we have to rein that in and work in a way that's sustainable over the long term. We saw the boom and the bust that we took, and I'm trying to avoid that. So you can never say that people don't need money. They desire it. They see this is a good thing, we'll spend it. Most of the money is going for a good, and therefore if you say we want less good, that feels bad. But if all you do is hand out goods, it is bad. So I'm trying to find some way of creating balance, and I think the university can be a fine university living within the funds that we've appropriated, particularly if they make the changes that I think will develop jointly between the president and myself.
And earlier you said that education had the biggest cuts and they're getting the biggest increases
yes.
That the economy's recovered. How does that apply to social services, which also got huge cuts over the past 4 years?
Well, social services have expanded dramatically. The health care, extra spending, it's tremendous. And the state is spending money, nothing like what the federal government's spending. The federal government is spending over $91 billion just in health care. And that's huge. Just the last few years, it's a huge increase, $20 billion. So there's a lot of money going, and when you spend money one place, you don't have to spend somewhere else. We're giving $1.5 billion for the movie tax credit over the next 5 years. That's real money. It's not coming back. We spent money on all these different programs. So the budget is tightly balanced, and we made the best judgments we could, recognizing that we have the health care responsibilities once we buy into the Affordable Care Act. And then secondly, we have Proposition 98, which drives all the spending on the education side. And then we're giving an increase to the universities. So there it is. We're spending all we can spend.
Monday, the need to address the deferred maintenance on highways and bridges, but yeah, here I'm reading here. They say we need to look at expanded and ongoing funding sources. Are you proposing anything specific? You want to just start a conversation with the legislature? I mean, what do you have in mind there?
I think you laid it out very clearly.
No, there was a question. Are you proposing anything specific, sir?
No. Other than I'm identifying the problem. I have a team working on infrastructure, and we're going to start engaging the constituency groups, including Republican leaders, and we're going to try to find what avenues of funding might be available. And I'm not going to say any more than that, other than to say it's difficult because we're spending a lot of money and we have a lot of different revenue sources, and it's always hard to find more. But we're going to look and see what we can, and I'm not going to preempt the discussions by predetermining what the outcome is. But I just we do have a need, and we're going to have to take care of it. And I'm going to see if we can't do it on a bipartisan basis, because I think that's the only way we can.
Governor, you've gotten some questions from some school district officials asking you to revisit the cap on school district reserves that was part of the budget last year. And they have criticized it as not consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. Locals know best. Any interest in revisiting that?
Well, there's some language in the budget about carrying on some discussions on this very issue, and we're going to go forward on that. And I do want to say that there is a rule, it's actually, I could quote it in Latin, I don't know that I will, about the exception proves the rule.
And so? Well,
The rule is subsidiarity. That particular provision appears to be a exception.
You've given me a pause, so
and
just let me follow
that
really
strengthens
quickly.
the rule, because you notice that you have to have an exception, because otherwise the rule prevails.
I'm not sure I've heard you explain, though, why you did it last year, because some of them say it was a favor to, people who are on your side, teachers union, for example.
We got Proposition 2 unanimously. The people passed it by almost 70% of the vote. And we took all the steps we needed to take to get done what I would bet a lot of people in this town don't even like. But we got it. And so we did what we had to do, and we'll do the best we can to make it even better as we go down the road.
Governor, are you open to using Proposition 2 revenue?
What?
Or are you open to using Prop 2 for paying down the retiree health liability?
No, we're going to keep Prop 2 for the next recession. We've had 10 of them since World War II. They come all the time. There was one under Davis, one under Schwarzenegger, there was one that hit Wilson. I had a couple, and one was ending when I was elected governor the first time, and then when I was leaving, another one was beginning. So I think the rainy day fund is a great idea. Almost 70% of the people that want it, and so we're keeping it as a hedge for when the downturn comes. So even when we have to manage and borrow and do some cuts, we can minimize it.
Well, half
and
the
that's
money
the point of it.
of Prop 2 is set aside to pay down long-term costs. Half goes into the rainy day fund, half to the costs. Well, how do you want to use that second half? Is that for retirement?
Well, we are already paying it. We have some debt repayment in this year's budget from the rainy day fund. But I do want to build up the rainy day fund. I want to use it sparingly. But if we reduce certain debts, then that's like saving money, because you can go incur those debts again when the downturn comes.
Governor, on infrastructure,
Director, it's time to stop relying as much on the gas tax, which is decreasing as people turn to cars that don't rely on gasoline as much, and more to start relying on mileage driven.
Well, that is a proposal that's under study. It's supposedly going to take 4 years. I'm going to speed it up, but obviously, to the extent we can bring down gasoline consumption, and that's certainly the goal that I laid out, up to 50%, we're going to have to find another way to finance the upkeep of the roads.
So does that mean like road usage charges? Like roads
that's one of the ideas we're
liquors in the
studying.
car?
And certainly that would create equity because whether people use electricity or natural gas or whatever they use, they're still boring down the roads.
Governor, there was an audit.
But
There was an audit of the court's
release, or the Judicial Branch Administration released on Wednesday, that said that the administration misspent over a 4-year period as much as $30 million. It criticized the size of the fleet of vehicles that the Administrative Office of the Courts, what was formerly called that, kept. That was Wednesday. That was before the budget, but not an extensive amount of time. Is that going to impact your budget decisions vis-a-vis the courts?
Well, we're giving the courts more money, and we do think they're pressed. As I noted, they've been facing pressures for a long time, the condition, and we think we're giving them the right amount of money, but they have to manage, and there are some areas of saving that they have to capture. And I think that audit showed some of the areas where they can become more efficient.
Are you satisfied that the judicial branch will handle those problems internally, or do you think that outside intervention is necessary to push the administration?
I think the Chief Justice is very well aware of the problem. She's creating her own groups to look into it, and I think they can handle the problem fine.
Governor, the budget proposes restoration of the 7% cut to IHSS hours. I know you felt strongly about not making that restoration last year. Can you explain why it's important to make it now?
Well, because we've always tried to find the revenue to pay for those, to pay for a restoration, and that's really been the understanding. If we can find the revenue, we can make the restoration, and that's why we're going for that particular revenue source.
Governor, on Medi-Cal, a lot of that growth, I understand, is from expanded eligibility. Is from expanded eligibility.
Yes.
But we also have 12.2 million people in this state that, as you say, are not rich, are not middle class. I'm wondering just, as the chief executive of the state, do you have, and on a human level, do you have concerns about those numbers where you're talking about, 31% of the state that is, as you said, not middle class? Is that both as a potential drain on the economy and also just as a human level?
Well, but that's why we did the local control formula. That's why we expanded the Affordable Care Act. That's why we're investing money in the Workforce Investment Act. I looked at the budget for the amount of money that's going to low-income Californians, and it's about a third of the budget, about close to just under $40 billion of the general fund budget. And if you take the federal funds that come in as well, you're looking at about $123 billion to deal with low-income people, whether it's child care or CalWorks or in-home supportive services, all the things, all that stuff. So, yeah, it's an issue, and it's something you got to think about. The idea of poverty really was brought home, for the most part, beginning in 1961 with the book The Other America. And then Johnson started the war on poverty. Before that, President Roosevelt talked about the forgotten American, 1/3 ill-housed, ill-clothed. So this is an issue that is part of America. It's part of the structure of modern individualism, capitalism, stratification. It's there. And I would say California does more than most states to mitigate that. But these structures that we all live within are in part local, but they're also in part global. And how you affect them is even challenging for the federal government as well as the state government. And I would say, given our investments, even in community colleges where we have a fee waivers for 70% of the people, we have a lot of pathways that can help people. But low-income status adds stresses, breaks down families, creates certain adaptive reactions that can be very discouraging and not stimulating for people to advance as much as others might like. So there it is. We do the best we can. Yeah.
At what point in the process, Governor, the money for the water bond, when will decisions be made about concrete spending plans for that, for example, for storage? At what point?
Well, we have a number of plans, and we have some people here Janelle here can give you answers after I'm finished. But we have a lot of different programs that we're going to spend this year. So we have a very good array of things that we're going to start, that we are doing, and we'll do after the June budget is signed. But
Senate President Pro Tem De Leon talked about eliminating the middle class scholarship that he signed a year ago, 2 years ago. Are you supportive of
I generally don't get into those kind of. I mean, there's a lot of proposals coming from upstairs, and well, we'll look at all of them. There's a lot of ways to do things. And, we will certainly look at whatever ways there are. I don't want to get into the kind of the inter-house interaction, so I'd be a little slow to jump on that. But there is an issue of how we are funding the university and how we provide all the scholarship money. If you add up all the money we spend, some people it's enormous, runs into the billions. And some people are saying we should put it all into a grant and give it to the student and let the student choose where he or she wants to go. So that's an idea. There's a lot of ways to think about how we might do this. And it is a very complicated system. 1/3 of the tuition is redistributed to help students. The Cal Grant automatically goes up whenever the university raises tuition. That automatically takes money from the Cal Grant program, takes money basically out of the general fund. So it's a complicated set of spending moves that have been generated over decades. And if somebody can come up with a more rational way or chip away and make it a little more efficient, yeah, I would be very interested in that.
Governor, would you like to see more action in this building this year on the issues raised in the Vergara lawsuit? And I'm not asking you about the lawsuit in particular, but clearly the judge even laid out in his ruling the legislature could take action to change the system on its own.
He could.
Would you like to see that?
I worked on some of those bills in the last few years. It's a contentious issue, and I would certainly welcome any improvements that people can suggest. But I will tell you, I have two nieces who are teachers, and one of them just got her tenure, and she was very glad to get her tenure. Very happy about that. So there's a very strong sense. And she makes about $50,000 a year, and not a lot of money for a woman with 3 children, 2 of them in college. So people are concerned, and this is built into the whole set of expectation by teachers. But yes, I would certainly work with anyone. I've been a supporter of charter schools where they don't have these rules and restrictions.
I raise it just because if the state loses that appeal, the tenure system could just be completely gone.
Well, look, we have a charter school system with 8% of the students that doesn't function with those particular safeguards, and it functions pretty darn well. So I am struck by how much teachers feel that their job security is so important. And I also think that the whole focus on firing people really misses the point. The big challenge, which is true 56 years ago, is true today. Recruiting teachers. Can we find them? It's not that easy. Can you find the math teachers? And can you retain them? And it's very tough work, particularly when you're dealing in the most challenging low-income environments. It's not as rewarding as a lot of people might like. So I'd say there's been a real intensive focus on the Vergara-type issues. And I would say that a few years ago, no one even talked about it. I asked that to Michael Kirst. He was head of the state board for 8 years. Did anyone ever bring this up? No. And they had a bunch of other things. So every 10 years, we focus on the next silver bullet. And I would say that, there's certainly issues there that reasonable people could well support. But it isn't really get at the big problem. And the big problem is training teachers, recruiting them, retaining them, inspiring them, and then they doing the same thing with the students. And that's not, I think most of these grandiose programs the last few years, from No Child Left Behind to Race to the Top, seem to all have faltered. And if you actually look at the great expectations that were laid out by Bush, and I think even Kennedy was supportive, and Congressman Miller, and then President Obama and Arnie Duncan, a lot of this remote direction has not proved to add all that many benefits. And at the end of the day, it's still a teacher in the classroom. Some are not so good, and getting rid of them is a nightmare. So I'm certainly open to dealing with that.
Governor, how about expanding Medi-Cal to cover immigrants who are in the country illegally?
Well, that's something that is going to be impacted by what President Obama does, and I'm not going to make any moves till I hear and see what he's doing.
There's a proposal beyond that, though, that would expand it even more than the immigration order from the
Well,
president.
look, the budget, there's not a lot of money left in the budget. So we're going to have to look very carefully at whatever we do. It's very tight. It's going to be a difficult next 4 years in dealing with the money.
Governor, on school facilities, I see you target state funding for districts most in need, but I don't see specific allocations of money for more facility funding. Education advocates say the schools are in disrepair? Or do you
Wait a
have
minute. We lowered the taxes to 55%. Most of the school bonds are passing, so they do have the local capacity. And under our program of trying to give more local control, I think that is not something the state. When we pass bonds, it's a very complicated process. It takes years. It's more expensive. I think the locals can do it more efficiently, and I think they're in the best position to judge how to allocate priorities.
Is that in opposition to a 2016 school bond then, I hear?
Well, it's certainly not support.
Governor, can you talk about how much money you actually think there is available for folks to play with on the non-98 side? Is that zero? Is that negative? Is that a small amount?
I'd say very, very little. But we'll see what the May revise. Maybe we'll see what the May revise brings. But I don't think there's a lot of money around.
Governor, is there
in fact, if I looked at all the liabilities, it's just the opposite.
Governor, if there seems to be a division here between you and most of the legislative leadership over the issue of poverty. They are very sympathetic to the idea that welfare grants need to be improved, that the family cap needs to be removed, and so forth. And you seem to say, no, the way out of poverty is, I guess, to get a job, right?
Well, to get trained and to develop the skills and wherewithal to become employable, yes. But we do have quite a safety net. I'd say $123 billion is pretty substantial, 1/3 of the budget of the general fund. And remember, the federal funding wouldn't be here if we didn't invest on our share. And it's a question of priorities. The people, everything. If people wanted to do some of those things, maybe we should have done those things before and not done other things. There's only so much money here. It's easy to say, let's do that, let's do that. I'm looking at the aggregate. And the aggregate is the liabilities are far exceeding the surpluses that we're looking at. And in terms of poverty, I moved to Oakland, which is a city with a lot of poverty, more than the state. As a general, I was the mayor. I met and came in contact with low-income people of many persuasions. I personally drove mothers to find shelter at night who came and knocked on the mayor's door at City Hall there. I went to Calcutta, India. I've worked with at the Home for the Dying. I think I do have a sensitivity to people's difficulties in life. But I do think when looking back at history, at starting with the war on poverty, and look at all we're spending now, and then just in 2 years, we added 4 million people to full health care, and that somehow is, well, okay, now what's next? So the trouble with the now what's next, that's an inevitable pressure for more taxes, and I don't know that the people are going to vote for them, and so I'm trying to create some balance. So there's always someone in need, and in fact, there's millions of someone's in need, and we're doing quite a lot, more than most states, I would say.
Does that imply that you would oppose the efforts to extend or make permanent the provisions of Prop 30?
I said that's a temporary tax, and that's my position.
Governor, can you talk about...
What?
Are current levels of CalWORKs grants sufficient to lift people out of poverty, or is that not the point of the program?
Out of poverty. Have the grants anywhere lifted anybody out of poverty? I mean, there are ways. We're doing a lot of things. There's the federal income tax credit. There's housing vouchers. There's the minimum wage. There's Medi-Cal. There's CalWORKs. These are all efforts that we're doing. And it's all a balance. And we're in a state, and ultimately the people have their own sentiments. And I think I'm representing a fair balance. And I would say a third of the budget is a significant contribution, particularly when we have all these other needs of the infrastructure. And by the way, the local control formula is very much aimed. Now, for years, there's been unequal funding. And now we've turned that around and targeted the students, not just dependent upon the wealth of the particular property in the district. So we are doing a lot. Is it ever, I suppose, until we have a more equal society, you're always going to be able to make that statement. But that's not the way the system that we particularly operate in. And if you look all around the world, yeah, England, France gives more income support. In fact, we had an income maintenance commission in the 1960s that no one even remembers. My father was on it. And the whole notion was maintain income. And I was just reading the Kerner report over the weekend, and there's a quote by Senator Robert Taft from some years before where he says America is rich enough to bring people to make sure that those who don't have enough can be given what they need. So these are all issues that have been around for a long time, and I think we're doing a good job in California. Comparatively, we're doing much more than other states, and we'll continue to do as much as we can.
Governor, getting back to the local control funding formula and exceptions and rules, one of the things that you did when you created that was you got rid of all these categorical programs. Now you're proposing for career tech to put categorically money back into that. Why did that rise to the level where you think you need to get back into the business of categorical appropriations to schools?
I don't think that does that. We've had, we talk about career and college and getting ready for those two things. And there's other things like linked learning and career tech. These are funding streams. We have workforce investment boards that are set up under federal law. We have a role to play in that. Our community colleges prepare people. The adult ed at the K-12 schools have various funding. We have loosened that up. And so it's all a mix. And I think you ought to ask Cohen for more detail on that particular question.
Governor, can you talk about what your budget does?
What?
Can you talk about what your budget does for middle-class Californians who might be feeling, the squeeze of, higher property values and the jobs that, lower or middle-class jobs that don't pay as much as they used to?
So we have the middle class that has a need, we have the poor that has a need, and then the rich feel that they're paying on it all. So we're trying to balance all that stuff. The whole government, the public safety, the colleges, the water, the roads, all that stuff. That's what government is. So I don't know that picking out categories of people and saying, okay, give us our share. I think we have to look at the general welfare of the state, and that's what we're trying to do.
What about in terms of creating jobs that pay?
$1.35 million is quite a lot.
Are those jobs paying enough money for Californians to live, given the cost of living?
Well, I can tell you one of my grandnieces, who's still living at home and making $30,000 in a so-called high-tech business in San Francisco after graduating from USF, certainly doesn't feel that she's getting paid enough. So
what do you say to her?
This is a big challenge.
What do you say to her?
Well, I'd say we're not going to adopt a socialist system with Leninism and all the rest of it. So where are we going? France and Germany's they're all in retreat. This is a challenging point. The modern economy is based on individual reward with most of the money moving toward the top. That's the system. And we try to mitigate that
But I would say the country is moving more to the right. As I look at more Republicans in Wisconsin, as you look at the shift in Maryland, Illinois, and Massachusetts, I think the mood is for less interference in the private economy. California, we're not going along with that. We're doing a lot of creative things in environment, in minimum wage, in workforce training, in supporting collective bargaining in the public sector and in the private sector with project labor agreements, all of which raise funds. But in a society organized as it is, you do have a stratification. And hopefully those wages will go up as the demand, as the economy expands, the pressure on labor to hire labor intensifies and the wages are pushed up. For whatever reason, there's been a slack as the economists talk in the labor market. That keeps wages down, but that doesn't last forever.
What about loosening regulations like CEQA then?
Well, if you want, that would not create good paid jobs among the building trades.
But would it create more jobs overall?
I don't. There's always room for CEQA reform, and we're going to look at some of that. I'm going to be talking to some people in this month about how to make CEQA better. But the gross economy of $2 trillion plus and how that's allocated, that's a global phenomenon. And what they're paying, what they're paying a college graduate who has to pay $40,000 a year to get a degree, and then is going to make $30,000, can't even afford to move out of the house at 24. I don't know. These are challenges. They have challenges in my own family. So how do we? I don't have all the answers for that. I don't know if anybody does. But one thing is, it's more of a national issue. But for that national issue to take any if you're talking about raising wages, strengthening labor unions raises wages, stimulating the economy so there's more pressure for hiring people, that raises wages. And then education does the same. And we have things, we're adding another $1 billion in workforce training. So we're doing a lot. Relative to the world, there's always, you can always identify. But remember, California has a pretty generous tax structure. We have a very robust public sector investment. We're very sympathetic to all the different groups that are pushing for a more equal society, if you compare us to anyone else in the country. So I'd say we're doing what we should do, and to the extent that more potential is politically viable, we'll do even more.
Governor, as you said, the generous tax structure is a lot of taxes are derived from a very small number of people in California. Yeah. Do you have any interest in broadening that, either to the sales tax or changing the income tax structure?
There's reducing it on the very high income and then adding it to these people that he talks about, the middle class and the poor people.
Or through expanding the sales tax structure, yeah.
Expanding, I mean making more people pay for...
Right.
That's an issue. Look, I think Mr. Hertzberg's going to come up with some great ideas, and I think people ought to listen to them and see where they go. But I can tell you this, taxing new people is always difficult. So if you tell people that their Pilates class now takes us 8.5% sales tax, they may not be as yoga happy as they were before.
Governor, you added in a proposal to your higher education funding scheme to freeze out-of-state student levels at UC. That brings in hundreds of $millions for the university, independently of anything you give them. So what's your thinking there?
My thinking is the University of California is created by the people of California. It's historically been for the citizens of the state. Yes, it's good to have some foreign students and some out-of-state people, but I don't think that should be viewed as a financial mechanism. It should be more the intellectual environment of the school. And I want as many Californians as possible to take advantage of it.
So are you essentially trying to cut off any additional revenue stream?
No, I think there's a lot of concern that people can't go to the university because someone's coming in from 5,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away. And I think we have to make sure Californians have a maximum of opportunity.
I think we're ready for Mr. Cohen here.
Cohen, you have a lot to come on up here.
Governor, before you leave, can I ask you one more question?
What's that?
Can you stand the microphone when I ask you the question? I apologize, but we have not heard you say much about what happened in the Bay Area and other places with those protests. I think there are people who would like to know what you thought about them, especially in your hometown.
Well, what I thought is, because I certainly was there, and that's why I went back and pulled the Kerner report. You may not know about that. Was the National Commission created by President Johnson after all the disorders and riots of the 67, 68. And in there's a lot to be said about the divisions in our society, the racial disparities and divisions. And they said if we don't take the right steps, we're headed toward a divided society. So I'd say we've made progress, but we still have issues, and these expressions of on the part of people in Oakland and all over the country, it's a feeling that there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of, when you look at the people who are getting into crime, into prison, it's not just a equal representation. It's disproportionately people of color, people of low income, and that's a concern. It's a concern of mine, and that's what I mentioned in my speech the other day. We're going to be doing some things to bring about more liberty and justice in our crime and punishment system.
Thanks, guys.